Chapter 1. The Sundial's Silent Witness. The late afternoon sun poured golden light over the manicured gardens of Thornfield Manor, where the centrepiece, a massive ancient sundial, stood upon a raised plinth of weathered stone. Its gnomon was slightly askew, as though knocked in haste, casting a distorted shadow that lay jagged across the marble surface. Guests drifted among clipped hedges and blossoming rose bushes, sipping champagne and murmuring compliments on Lady Greycroft's exquisite taste. Yet beneath the polite veneer of laughter and silk dresses lay a current of unease, for appearances masked a far darker reality. Hastings, fresh from the station and still adjusting to village time, had barely set foot inside the gardens when his expression tightened. "Mon cher Poirot," he called softly, touching his friend's impeccably groomed sleeve. "Something troubles me. Notice how the sundial's pointer is bent, and that there—" He pointed toward a small smudge of crimson on the marble rim. Poirot's small grey cells leapt into motion. He lowered his lorgnette, peered closely at the bloodstain, then surveyed the scene with minutely raised eyebrows. With deliberate calm, he guided Hastings across the lawn, stepping lightly over trampled grass, where guests had unwittingly obscured the critical spot. A single shoe print, pressed into the soft earth beside the sundial's base, betrayed a hurried departure. "Remarkable, Hastings," Poirot murmured. "The victim, or perhaps the perpetrator, left these clues in plain sight. Yet no one here has noticed. Observe the spoil of the rosebush nearby," he added, indicating branches with snapped thorns. "Someone struggled." He paused, eyes narrowing as he watched a maid brush past them, her face pale, her hands trembling as she lifted a discarded fan. Moments later, a piercing scream cracked the air. Heads turned. The murmur of polite conversation faltered into terror. Lady Greycroft herself emerged from the drawing-room window, her face ashen. In her gloved hand she held a small jewelled brooch, broken, its pin stained scarlet. "Come quickly," she cried, voice wavering. It's Mr. Blake. He's—" They rushed toward the great terrace. There, just beyond the double, doors leading into the house, lay the body of Mr. Victor Blake, the manor's solicitor and Lady Greycroft's most trusted adviser. He was sprawled on his back, one hand clutching the hem of his waistcoat, the other draped limply to the side. His visionless eyes stared upward at the stoic facade of Thornfield Manor, and the glint of a slender knife protruded from his breast pocket, a detail so unusual it fetched gasps of horror from the onlookers. Poirot knelt beside the body, gingerly, extracting the blade with gloved fingers. The handle was plain, yet fine, an heirloom quality, possibly antique. He noted the angle of entry, the absence of footprints around the immediate spot, and a faint odour of lavender lingering in the air. "Intoxicating, n'est-ce pas?" he remarked quietly to Hastings, who looked on, horrified, and yet not from his own pocket. "Someone has taken care to obscure the scent of struggle." Suddenly, a voice rang out. Captain Cavendish, one of the guests, his khaki jacket buttoned and his posture rigid. "Madame, if you will forgive me, but might I suggest we send for the constable? Nothing must be disturbed." Lady Greycroft closed her eyes, steeling herself. "Of course, Captain." She waved to a footman, who hurried off with trembling steps. Poirot rose, dusting his hands on his immaculate trousers. Before we allow the police to trample over these delicate clues, I must ask that all assembled here remain exactly where they are." He surveyed the cluster of elegantly attired guests. The austere Captain Cavendish, Mrs. Almina Hawthorne, whose jewelled necklace caught the last rays of sun. Mr. Lionel Marsh, the sculptor, his hands still smudged with clay from earlier demonstration. Miss Cecilia Ryder, fluttering behind her fan, eyes bright with curiosity, and standing apart, Dr. Evelyn Stanton, whose cool composure betrayed nothing. With the grace of a conductor raising his baton, Poirot motioned for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that Mr. Victor Blake has been found, dead by what appears to be a deliberate stabbing. Until the authorities arrive, I must ask you to remain here. Leave nothing to chance. Your freedom, your reputations, even your raw nerves depend upon it." A hush fell over the garden as the guests exchanged startled glances. Flowers trembled in a sudden breeze, and the tilted sundial, its gnomon still bent, seemed to watch over them like a silent sentinel. The air, once charged with polite frivolity, now weighed heavy with suspicion. Hastings at Poirot's side whispered in awe, "Surely this is the most dramatic hook you have ever devised." Poirot allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile. "Mon ami, this is no mere invention of mine. But the puzzle is laid before us. Who among these fine people turned a sundial's shadow into a weapon of death? We must unmask the motive and catch the hand that bent the gnomon and bent a man's life to its end." He placed a gentle hand on Lady Greycroft's arm. "Madame, may I begin by questioning you?" As the fading sunlight traced long shadows across the cobblestones, Poirot, the master of psychological deduction, prepared to unravel the first threads of this high society tapestry. Threads knotted with secrets, lies, and the silent testimony of a tilted sundial. Chapter 2. The gathering of suspects. Poirot arranged the assembled company in a loose semicircle on the gravelled terrace, the late afternoon sun now slanting toward the rose gardens. Guests glanced nervously at each other, uncertain whether to meet or avoid one another's eyes. Hastings stood beside his friend, notebook in hand, ready to record every nuance of voice and expression. "Mon ami," Poirot whispered to Hastings, "observe their posture. Each person's stance is a question in itself. Note how Captain Cavendish remains rigid, as though on parade. How Mrs. Hawthorne's fingers toy with her pearls. How Mr. Marsh shifts his weight from foot to foot. How Miss Ryder clutches her fan like a shield. And how Dr. Stanton stands apart, unruffled." He smiled thinly. "Excellent material for my little grey cells." Lady Greycroft, her composure returning, lifted her chin. "I shall answer your questions, Monsieur Poirot, but afterward you must allow me to summon the local constable. The scene must be secured." Her voice trembled only slightly. Poirot inclined his head. "Naturally, madam. Let us begin." He turned to Captain Cavendish. "Captain, you are the master of protocol and discipline. Tell me, at what time did you first notice anything amiss this afternoon?" Cavendish cleared his throat. "Shortly after 3 o'clock, sir. Lady Greycroft hosted a small demonstration of Mr. Marsh's sculpting talents. I observed Victor Blake examining the sundial with some curiosity, as he often did. He was fascinated by antiquities." Then I retired to the terrace to fetch a glass of port. When I returned, the sundial gnomon was bent. I mentioned it to Lady Greycroft, and she invited us all to gather here. I assumed it was merely a peccadillo of accident. Did anyone else approach the sundial during that interval? Poirot asked, steepling his fingers. Cavendish looked around. No one that I noticed, though I confess I did not linger long. Indeed, I wished to admire Mr. Marsh's sculpture. Indeed, Poirot turned to Mrs. Hawthorne. Her pearl necklace glinted nervously. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said softly, "you claim to have been 12 paces from the sundial when you heard a faint crack. What were you doing at that moment?" She swallowed. "I was conversing with Miss Ryder about the new gardening schedules. I moved closer to hear Lady Greycroft's instructions on the rose pruning. Then I saw Mr. Blake's pince-nez glasses lying shattered beside the sundial." "Broken glasses? Interesting." Poirot's eyes gleamed. He leaned toward Hastings. "Note the discrepancy. The good lady speaks of a crack, yet the broken spectacles suggest someone more forceful than a delicate rosebush encounter." Next, he addressed Mr. Lionel Marsh, whose hands still bore traces of clay. "Mr. Marsh, you were demonstrating your latest bust when you felt a sudden chill. You stepped away from your display. Why?" Marsh brushed clay dust from his cuffs. I had caught sight of Mr. Blake frowning at the sundial." He shook his head, then began circling it, running his fingers along the inscription. I fancied he discovered a flaw. I returned to him, only to see the gnomon bent almost in two. Poirot's thin moustache quivered with curiosity. "And yet the two of you did not touch it again." Marsh hesitated. "No, I swore I heard a stifled cry. I thought perhaps a bird had flown into the stone, startling us both." "A bird," Poirot repeated, arching an eyebrow, "would scarcely leave a smear of blood." He scribbled in Hastings's notebook. "Blood plus. Broken glasses plus bent gnomon." Turning to Miss Cecilia Ryder, Poirot noticed her white-gloved hands tremble. "Miss Ryder, you arrived late from the drawing-room. You passed the sundial on your way outside. Did you see anything unusual?" She fanned herself rapidly. Yes, monsieur. I saw Mr. Blake kneeling, as though to inspect the dial more closely. Then I heard a whisper, too soft to make out. Her cheeks flushed. I thought it was merely conversation. Conversation indeed, Poirot mused. Do you recall whose voice? She shook her head. I apologize. 'Twas too low. I only remember the accent, perhaps. A northern tone? Northern, Poirot repeated. We shall note that. Finally, he turned to Dr. Evelyn Stanton, whose calm demeanour stood in stark contrast to the others. Dr. Stanton, as physician, you have surely taken note of the wound. Dr. Stanton inclined her head, inspecting the body now covered by a silken cloth. It was precise, angled upward at 45 degrees, entering just to the left of the heart. Death must have been instantaneous. No defensive wounds, which suggests the victim was taken completely by surprise. Poirot thanked her. You may return to the others. He beckoned Lady Greycroft forward. Madam, permit me to clarify. Did Mr. Blake have any quarrels with your guests? Lady Greycroft's lips pressed into a thin line. Victor was often forthright. Too forthright, some said. He argued with Captain Cavendish about the placement of the new rose beds. He chastised Mr. Marsh for placing his bust too near the sundial. He disagreed with Miss Ryder on the proper protocol for afternoon teas, and once I overheard him admonishing Dr. Stanton for her choice of lavender perfume in the library. It interfered with his concentration. She eyed her guests one by one. He irritated us all in some fashion. Poirot nodded. A closed circle of motives indeed, but to identify the hand that twisted a sundial and twisted a man's fate, we must delve deeper. He raised his voice. Until the constable arrives, I ask that no one leave this terrace. Each of you remains under my observation. Allow no one to disturb the body, the dial, or any potential clue. As shadows lengthened, the company settled into uneasy silence. Hastings jotted furiously in his notebook, while Poirot surveyed the suspects with the air of a spider poised at the centre of its web. Every minuscule tension, every flicker of the eye, would be a thread he could pull to unmask the killer. And in that charged stillness, Thornfield Manor's gardens held their breath, awaiting the next move in Poirot's intricate psychological game. Chapter 3. Poirot arrives at Thornfield. A soft rustle of silk announced the arrival of the slim figure, stepping lightly down the gravel path from the main house. Detective Hercule Poirot paused, lifting his chin as if savouring each sound, each nuance of motion. His dark eyes, framed by the perfect curve of his moustache, took in the assembled guests with an almost imperceptible smile. "Mes amis," he said in his crisp Belgian accent, "I trust you will forgive my delay. I encountered some difficulty threading my way through the rose beds." He glanced at the shattered pince-nez and bent gnomon. "But nothing, I hope, beyond rectification." Lady Greycroft curtsied, relief washing across her features. "Monsieur Poirot, we are infinitely grateful you came so swiftly." She gestured toward her trembling footman, who carried a small silver tray. On it, a tiny phial of smelling salts and a handkerchief. Poirot accepted the offering with a graceful nod. "Thank you. One must always guard against fainting." He dabbed at his brow, then allowed his gaze to rest on each suspect. "Permit me, if you will, to introduce myself properly." He cleared his throat. "I am Hercule Poirot, retired from Chium, international service, and more recently, investigator in matters of the utmost delicacy. I have come at Lady Greycroft's request to uncover the truth behind the tragic death of Monsieur Victor Blake. I trust you will cooperate fully." Captain Cavendish stiffened but inclined his head. "Of course, sir. Whatever you require." Mrs. Hawthorne offered her gloved hand. "I am at your disposal, monsieur." Mr. Marsh bowed, clay dust still clinging to his cuffs. "An honour, detective." Miss Ryder fluttered her fan. "I hope I can be of assistance." Dr. Stanton observed, quietly from the edge of the circle, but nodded in understanding. Poirot tapped his foot with deliberate precision. "First, I think we should move indoors to a more comfortable setting. The chill in the air may dull our faculties." He motioned toward the drawing-room, where sunlight still filtered through tall windows onto polished oak floors. "Hastings, escort these gentlemen and ladies inside. I shall examine the scene more closely in a moment." Hastings nodded eagerly and began shepherding the group across the terrace. Poirot remained by the sundial, his gaze fixed on the bloodstain and the knife's path into Blake's heart. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured as Hastings returned. Observe here. The angle of the knife suggests the assailant was shorter than our victim, and the absence of footprints at this exact spot is curious. Someone must have placed the blade afterward. Hastings crouched beside him. But the bent gnomon! Could that have been the murder weapon? Poirot tapped the stone gently. Possible, though the steel of the gnomon seems too slender for a lethal thrust. More likely a distraction, to draw attention away from the true instrument. He straightened and followed the others inside, the murmur of scandalized voices trailing behind him. Once in the drawing room, Poirot selected a seat by the hearth and gestured for everyone to take theirs. He produced his notebook and placed it on his knee. "We shall commence with individual interviews," he announced, voice calm but firm. "I will speak with each of you in turn, beginning with Lady Greycroft, then Captain Cavendish, and so on. I ask you all to answer truthfully and without embellishment." Lady Greycroft poured tea with trembling hands as Hastings circulated porcelain cups. Poirot watched the steam rise, momentarily lost in thought. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he gestured for Lady Greycroft to come forward. "And now," he said softly, "the first of many small grey cells will be set to work." Outside, the setting sun dipped below the treetops, casting the drawing room in a warm amber glow. Within its walls, the first true interview of Poirot's investigation was about to begin. Chapter 4. Initial Interviews. Poirot settled into a deep velvet armchair beside the glowing hearth. The soft crackle of the fire, a gentle counterpoint to the tense silence. Hastings took his seat opposite, notebook poised. One by one, Poirot invited each guest closer, his manner polite yet incisive, his questions sparking revealing hesitations. Lady Greycroft was first. She clasped her gloved hands, eyes rimmed with weariness. "Madam," Poirot began, "your friendship with Mr. Blake was long-standing. Tell me of your last conversation." Lady Greycroft inhaled slowly. "He wished to discuss the sundial's inscription. He believed the Latin motto was erroneous." Her voice trembled. "I suggested we delay until tomorrow, but he insisted we correct it today." Poirot nodded, tapping his fingers. "And did that disagreement leave any ill will?" She hesitated. "He was firm, but never unkind to me. He loved precision above all. A useful trait, and one some might resent." Poirot folded his hands. Captain Cavendish followed, sitting ramrod straight. "Captain, you mentioned a dispute over the rose beds. Explain." "Merely an aesthetic difference," Cavendish said crisply. "Blake demanded the new beds encroach on the grass, contrary to Lady Greycroft's design. I defended her plans." "And your feelings?" Poirot probed. I was frustrated, yes, but never enough to harm him." Poirot's eyes glittered. "Yet frustration can twist intense, non?" Mrs. Hawthorne, pearls clutched tight, appeared next. "Mrs. Hawthorne, you discovered the broken pince-nez. What did you do?" "I stood back, horrified," she whispered. "I wanted to help him up, but I feared making matters worse." "And the bloodstain?" "I thought to fetch assistance, but Captain Cavendish moved first." Poirot observed her trembling fingers. "Fear can paralyze, sometimes more deadly than a knife." Mr. Marsh adjusted his clay-smudged cuffs as he approached. "Your sculpture was interrupted. Why?" swallowed. "I heard a cry. I rushed to see if Mr. Blake had hurt himself on the sundial." "Had you quarrelled with him earlier?" Marsh looked away. "We argued over positioning. It was merely professional pride." "Pride," Poirot murmured, "can be a potent motive." Miss Ryder, fan unfurled, spoke next. "I overheard a whisper near the dial," she confessed, "but the voice was muffled, too distant for clarity." "Yet you moved away rather than investigate." Poirot's tone was gentle. "I feared scandal," she admitted. "Better to preserve decorum." Lastly, Dr. Stanton approached with measured steps. "Monsieur Poirot, from a medical standpoint, the wound aligns with a left-handed assailant." "That is invaluable," Poirot replied. "And the lavender scent, was it your doing?" She inclined her head. "A habit, nothing more." Poirot closed his notebook. "Thank you all. You have each provided insight, yet also contradictions. Tomorrow, when we revisit the sundial and its witness, your statements will be tested against fresh evidence. For now, rest and consider. Truth often hides behind polite facades." A hush fell. The crackling fire the only reply, Poirot's gaze drifted to the mantel clock, its hands ticking inexorably toward uncovering the first false lead. Chapter 5. The First False Lead. Before dawn, Poirot lay awake in his crisp white sheets, replaying each detail of the interviews. The memory of Dr. Stanton's cool assessment of a left-handed wound lingered, as did Mrs. Hawthorne's quivering fingers and Captain Cavendish's rigid composure. By the time Hastings arrived for an early walk, Poirot was already seated at the small writing desk, pen in hand. "Mon ami," Poirot began, "we shall return to the sundial at first light. I have formed a hypothesis I wish to test." In the pale morning glow, the party reassembled by the tilted sundial. The bent gnomon had been removed overnight for safekeeping, and Poirot gestured toward its cradle. "Observe this fragment." He turned it so the guests could see the tiny nick at its base. "A blow struck here, deliberate and forceful." Dr. Stanton frowned. "You believe this was used as a weapon?" "Not necessarily," Poirot replied, "but the nick suggests the assailant gripped the gnomon before discarding it." He raised a gloved finger towards Mrs. Hawthorne. "Madame, you admitted you stood nearest when the gnomon was first bent. Did you touch it?" She gasped. I only drew back in fright. "And yet," Poirot continued, "the finger marks here are not slender, but broad." He indicated smudges on the stone where the gnomon stood. Not the shape of a woman's glove, but rather something more substantial. Captain Cavendish's brow furrowed. "You suggest it was a man." "Precisely." Poirot turned to Marsh. "Mr. Marsh, your boot prints were found here, pressed into the damp ground." He pointed to shallow indentations. "Tell me, is your right boot broader than your left?" Marsh blanched. I didn't notice." He knelt to study the prints, while Poirot offered water to Mrs. Hawthorne, who trembled visibly. Poirot tapped his notebook. "And Dr. Stanton's lavender scent? It was strongest near the sundial. Doctor, you wore that perfume yesterday?" Dr. Stanton's pale cheek twitched. "Yes, always in the morning. But so did the victim. He used the same brand. Hastings recorded every exchange, and Poirot's theory took shape. Blake had been lured under pretense of a gardening dispute, ambushed from behind by someone taller and left-handed. All signs pointed toward Captain Cavendish, whose rigid bearing and known disagreement over the rose beds provided motive. When Poirot announced his conclusion, Cavendish's posture slackened. I see. You think I struck him?" His voice was barely audible. "Alas, it seemed so," Poirot said gently. "Your boot shape, your strength, the angle of the blow, all indicated you." The captain drew in a shuddering breath. "I swear, Hercule, I love that man like a brother." Poirot inclined his head. "Emotion can confound the facts, Captain, but until proven otherwise, you were the most likely suspect." Eyes shifted among the group, tension crackling. Hastings caught Poirot's eye and saw a flicker of doubt. "Mon ami, are you certain?" he whispered once the guests departed. Poirot folded his arms. "For the moment, yes. But beware. The first theory is often the false lead." And with that warning, he prepared to delve deeper into the lives and secrets of Thornfield Manor's inhabitants. Chapter 6. The Psychological Game. That afternoon, the drawing-room felt charged with subtle tension as Poirot invited the remaining guests to tea. The mahogany table was laid with china cups and slices of lemon cake, yet the mood was far from convivial. Hastings noted how even the rustle of a sugar cube seemed to echo under Poirot's discerning gaze. "Mes amis," Poirot began, pouring tea with deliberate care. "I thank you for returning at such short notice. It is time for a small experiment." He placed his cup down and turned to Captain Cavendish. "Captain, you believed yourself under suspicion. Tell me, did you sleep well last night?" Cavendish met Poirot's eyes evenly. I slept sufficiently, monsieur. Why do you ask?" "Because," Poirot replied softly, "it is said that guilt steals one's rest. I wondered whether you found comfort in dreams, or was each hour plagued by doubt?" He poured another cup, then passed it to Mrs. Hawthorne. "Madame, you too looked uneasy this morning. Did you hear the crows at dawn?" Mrs. Hawthorne blinked and accepted the tea. "I heard only the wind," she murmured. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, the wind, invisible, yet its presence felt. Much like truth, n'est-ce pas?" His eyes danced as he set down the cup. He leaned forward. "I propose we revisit the sundial, and each of you shall explain exactly how you came upon it yesterday. Doubtless, your stories will now align more closely with the evidence." With practised calm, Poirot led them back through the garden. Captain Cavendish strode stiffly. Mr. Marsh shuffled at the rear. Mrs. Hawthorne clutched her pearls. Miss Ryder fanned herself vigorously, and Dr. Stanton followed with serene composure. Once before the sundial, Poirot stood with hands clasped behind his back. "Captain, you claimed to fetch port at 3, yet your glass bears no lipstick stain, though Mrs. Hawthorne's does." He indicated the green-stained rim of a discarded crystal glass on a nearby bench. Cavendish's jaw tightened. "And you, madam," Poirot continued, "spoke of a crack. But this fragment," he held up a small piece of shattered crystal, "matches not the gnomon, but the wine-glass." Mrs. Hawthorne's cheeks paled. Marsh shifted uneasily as Poirot turned to him. "You heard a bird's cry, yet the glass would not shatter so. Birds enrage by pecking, not by striking." Marsh swallowed hard, clay dust dusting his fingers. Poirot's gaze lingered on Miss Ryder. "And you, mademoiselle, said you moved away to avoid scandal. But you dropped this." He held a slender hairpin. "In your haste. It is engraved with your initials." Her eyes flickered with shock. Finally he addressed Dr. Stanton. "Doctor, your lavender scent, you say, matched Blake's. Yet Monsieur Blake preferred rosewater. Lavender is your signature." Dr. Stanton's composure slipped for the briefest instant, and Poirot seized on it. "Observe," he said, stepping back and sweeping his gaze across them. "Each of you has inadvertently betrayed yourself through these little actions. A glass too clean, a misplaced shard, a hairpin, a perfume too strong. Such details are the true language of the soul." A hush settled over the circle. Hastings, notebook forgotten, watched as Poirot's challenge reverberated through their minds. No one spoke, for the web of observation had closed tightly around them. The psychological game was afoot, and beneath polite facades, each suspect. I now wondered which of them would crack first. Chapter 7. A startling development. The tension had scarcely settled when a sharp cry rent the air. Captain Cavendish clutched his throat, staggered to his feet, and collapsed against the drawing-room's hearthrug. Hastings and Dr. Stanton were instantly at his side. The others recoiled in fear. "Poison!" Dr. Stanton exclaimed after a swift examination. His pulse rapid and weak. "He's been dosed with something. Digitalis, I believe." Hastings knelt beside the captain, checking for the telltale nausea that precedes heart complications. Mrs. Hawthorne pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Miss Ryder's fan fluttered as she backed away. Mr. Marsh hovered uncertainly. Even Lady Greycroft looked stricken. Poirot rose, eyes sharp. "Observe, mes amis. The glass from which he drank still rests on the side table. No lipstick stain. Captain Cavendish did not drink tea, but a glass of wine." He pointed to a half-full crystal tumbler. "Someone substituted the contents." Dr. Stanton fetched smelling salts while Hastings secured the room. The captain lay pallid, sweating, yet conscious enough to whisper, I feared this might happen. I told you they would go to extremes." Poirot's lips tightened. "You feared, Captain. Name the suspect." Cavendish's voice was too faint to be heard. Dr. Stanton straightened. "He has lost too much strength. We must move him to his room at once." As attendants carried Cavendish away, Poirot gathered the remaining 5 in the hallway. Another victim, or nearly so, proves the murderer's resolve. This was no random act, but a calculated attempt to silence. You, my friends, are now all targets and witnesses. A hush fell. Outside, the evening sky darkened, and Thornfield Manor's corridors seemed to whisper of concealed malice. Poirot's little grey cells raced. This second crime would unveil new dimensions of the killer's mind, and bring him one step closer to capture. Chapter 8. Poirot's hidden clue-late that evening. After Captain Cavendish had been safely tended in his chambers, Poirot summoned Hastings to the library. The lamps cast pools of amber light over rows of leather-bound volumes, and the ticking of the grandfather clock marked each heartbeat of the investigation. "Mon ami," Poirot began, standing before the fireplace and turning a page of Lady Greycroft's ledger. "We have witnessed 2 assaults upon Mr. Blake's person, and one upon Captain Cavendish. yet the threads remain tangled until we unearth the hidden clue that binds them. Hastings leaned against a mahogany table. "You mentioned this ledger. What does that suggest?" Poirot held up the book. "Lady Greycroft keeps meticulous accounts here, does she not? Note the recent entry. Yesterday's date. A withdrawal of a substantial sum, labelled simply Sundial Restoration." He tapped the page with a slender finger. £500 spent on repairing the very monument that witnessed the crime. Hastings frowned, but Lady Greycroft said she postponed the inscription until tomorrow. "Ah," Poirot smiled, "but someone evidently seized the opportunity to tamper with the sundial, and perhaps with her finances." He closed the ledger and retrieved from his coat pocket the broken fragment of the wineglass from the terrace. "And this, Hastings, is not ordinary crystal. It bears the maker's mark of the famous Hawthorne and Cove." Hastings's eyes widened. "Mrs. Hawthorne's family business." "Exactly. Yet she claimed ignorance of the glass's provenance. Why would she not recognize her own family's hallmark?" They heard a soft shuffle, and Dr. Stanton entered, bearing a small object in gloved hands. "Monsieur Poirot, you asked me to retrieve this." She revealed a torn fragment of paper, the lining of Victor Blake's pocket. On it was half of a hastily scrawled message: "Meet me by the Sun at 4 sharp." Poirot's eyes gleamed. A rendezvous arranged under cover of the sundial. Someone lured Blake there with a secret meeting, and the assailant capitalized on his punctuality. He pressed his lips together. But who would know Mr. Blake's habits so intimately as to select that precise time and place? Hastings tapped his chin. His solicitor's appointment schedule, only the innermost circle would be aware. Poirot strode to the mantel, where Lady Greycroft's framed photograph stood, her smiling profile before the sundial. He studied the stone in the photo. The gnomon sat perfectly upright. "This photo was taken last month," he murmured. "In that time, someone has had access to the gardens after hours. The iron latch on. The gate bears fresh scratch marks, meaning the culprit returned under cover of darkness." Hastings said slowly. "Mon Dieu, yes," Poirot exclaimed softly. "A person of calculation, entering alone, armed with precise knowledge. They orchestrated a false quarrel, disguised their weapon, and then attempted to silence the only eyewitness, Captain Cavendish." He paused, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "The ledger entry, the glass, the pocket note, the scratched latch, these are the discrete pieces of my hidden clue. The common denominator is proximity to Lady Greycroft's private affairs." Hastings leaned forward. "You suspect Lady Greycroft herself?" Poirot steepled his fingers. "Not yet, Hastings, but the truth lies somewhere within this circle of deception. Tomorrow we shall gather all present and reveal the interplay of finances and motives that has brought us here." As the grandfather clock chimed midnight, Poirot's little grey cells hummed with anticipation. The hidden clue had emerged from the shadows, and with it the path to unmasking the murderer took shape, slowly, inexorably, under the silent watch of the tilted sundial. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Ledger. Before dawn broke, Hastings stole quietly down the corridor toward Lady Greycroft's private study, intending to retrieve Poirot's tea. The door, usually ajar at this hour, was firmly closed and unusually silent. He tapped lightly, then opened it to discover the room in disarray. Lady Greycroft's ledger lay on the floor, its binding torn. Several pages were missing. The oak desk drawer stood open, emptied of its usual contents. Hastings's heart raced as he gathered fragments of torn paper, noting the inked scrawl. Must repay before midnight, or all revealed. He hurried to Poirot's door and rapped sharply. "Mon cher Poirot, you must see this." Poirot rose, tying his dressing gown, and followed Hastings with calm urgency. In the study's dim lamplight, he surveyed the ruined ledgers, the toppled inkwell, and the small footprints, bare and narrow, leading to the window, which bore scratch marks from inside. "A second crime, Hastings," Poirot said gravely, "this one of desperation. The ledger contained evidence of clandestine payments, perhaps bribes or hush money. Someone sought to bury these secrets." Outside, Lady Greycroft appeared, alarmed at the commotion. "My study, ransacked! You must help me recover it." Poirot offered her a steadying hand. "Madame, remain calm. Tell me plainly, were there any other documents in that drawer?" She swallowed. "Only correspondence, letters between Victor, Blake and myself regarding the sundial restoration." Her voice trembled as she added, "He warned me someone was watching us." "Watching us?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. He bent to inspect the scrabbled marks on the window-sill. "And climbed in here by your account?" Lady Greycroft hesitated. "Yes, but I assumed it was the gardener, searching for tools." Poirot rose, pocketing the torn note. A convenient assumption, yet the intruder clearly knew what they sought. This missing ledger page, the one Hastings retrieved, speaks of a deadline. Midnight. He tapped the fragment. That was last night. The intruder struck again before the hour passed. Hastings glanced at the footprints. "They left in haste." "Indeed," Poirot agreed. But their haste betrayed care. They wore thin slippers, leaving almost no prints. Someone accustomed to moving silently. Someone hiding in plain sight. As dawn's first light filtered through the shattered window, Poirot gazed at Lady Greycroft's anxious face and the torn pages. "This revelation shifts our course, mes amis. We must discover who stood to gain by silencing not only Mr. Blake, but also Lady Greycroft's secrets." The air trembled with anticipation. A new clue had emerged, and with it, another layer of deception ready to be unravelled. Chapter 10. The Final Gathering. Late the following afternoon, the drawing-room at Thornfield Manor was prepared for an assembly unlike any other. The heavy drapes were drawn to temper the slanting rays of the sun, and the rosewood chairs were arranged in a precise semicircle facing the ornate fireplace. At its centre stood Poirot's small mahogany lectern, atop which rested his notebook and a single brass sundial, an empty replica of the original, its gnomon perfectly straight. The atmosphere crackled with expectancy. Each guest knew this would be the moment when the web of deception unspooled into threads of truth. One by one, the assembled company took their seats. Lady Greycroft entered first, her pale gown almost luminous in the dim light, followed by Mrs. Hawthorn, still clutching her pearl necklace as though it were a lifeline, and Mr. Lionel Marsh, whose restless eyes betrayed both curiosity and apprehension. Miss Cecilia Ryder swept into the room with a faint rustle of chiffon, and Dr. Evelyn Stanton closed the circle with her composed, unreadable expression. Near the doorway stood Hastings, his notebook at the ready, while, reclining comfortably in a high-backed chair opposite Poirot, sat the recovering Captain Cavendish, a white silk handkerchief pressed to his lips. Poirot rose from behind the lectern with unhurried elegance, his moustache perfectly groomed, his dark eyes shining with controlled intensity. He extended his hand in a gentle gesture of welcome. "Mes amis," he began, his voice smooth and resonant, "I thank you for gathering here once more. We stand at the threshold of revelation. Soon the truth, as steadfast as the sun itself, will illuminate the heart of this mystery." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Mrs. Hawthorne swallowed audibly. Captain Cavendish shifted in his chair. Even the steadfast Dr. Stanton leaned forward, eyes fixed upon Poirot's every movement. "Let us consider the sequence of events," Poirot continued, picking up the brass sundial and turning it slowly, so each person could see its flawless face. "First, the bent gnomon, an overt but perhaps misleading clue. Second, the stabbing of Monsieur Victor Blake, executed with chilling precision. Third, the attempted poisoning of Captain Cavendish, a stroke of desperation aimed at silencing the sole witness. Fourth, the removal of Lady Greycroft's financial ledger, intended to obscure clandestine transactions. Each of these incidents is a piece of the puzzle, and each points to a deeper motive." He laid the sundial on the lectern and opened his notebook. "Now, allow me to call upon your statements and the evidence we have uncovered." Poirot turned to Mrs. Hawthorne. "Madame, you discovered the broken pince-nez beside the sundial, yet the piece of crystal marked with Hawthorne's adore belonged unmistakably to your family's glassware. You insisted you knew nothing of this, but the ledger shows you withdrew funds precisely for sundial restoration. Tell us again, why did you finance this project so secretly?" Mrs. Hawthorne rose, voice trembling. I owed Monsieur Blake a debt. He threatened to expose a scandal, claiming I had manipulated my husband's will. I paid him to keep the matter private, but I never intended him harm." "An important admission," Poirot nodded gravely. "A motive for ensuring his silence, but not, perhaps, for murder. Let us move on." He turned to Mr. Marsh. "Monsieur Marsh, your clay-stained fingers bear the evidence of your artistry, yet also fingerprints found upon the missing pages of the ledger. You claimed to have heard a cry, and rushed to the sundial, but you did not mention retrieving any papers. Why did you handle that ledger?" Marsh's cheeks flushed. "I saw the torn pages fluttering near the window. I intended to return them to Lady Greycroft, but fear overcame me. I feared being implicated." "Fear indeed," Poirot murmured. "But fear can also drive one to desperate acts." Poirot shifted his gaze to Miss Ryder. "Mademoiselle, you dropped a hairpin in the garden, engraved with your initials. You claimed you retreated to avoid scandal, but the pin was found in the study among Lady Greycroft's letters. You later denied entering her private rooms. Explain yourself." Miss Ryder's eyes darted caustically around the circle. I did not enter her study. I found the pin near the sundial and kept it as a curiosity," she stammered. "I confess it was foolish, but I swear I touched nothing else." "A curious story," Poirot replied softly, yet inconsistent with the scratched latch marks. "We found on the study window footprints too light for your afternoon slippers. You had means to slip inside undetected." The air grew colder as Miss Ryder faltered under Poirot's gaze. Next, the detective turned to Dr. Stanton. "Doctor, your expertise in poisons is unrivalled. The toxin used was digitalis, applied to Captain Cavendish's wine-glass. You claimed Victor Blake favoured rosewater over lavender, yet smelled of lavender at the scene. You also have unaccounted journals in which Blake's research threatened your medical innovations. What, doctor, did you hope to gain from silencing him?" Dr. Stanton inclined her head slightly. "Monsieur Blake discovered plagiarism in my published works. He threatened to ruin my career. I confronted him by the sundial, demanding retraction, but I did not kill him, though I confess I substituted his wine." Her voice softened, hoping only to frighten him. She paused, and a hush fell. Poirot's eyes held hers steadily before he nodded. A strong motive, but not yet proof of murder. Finally, Poirot faced Captain Cavendish, pale but determined. "Captain, your dispute with Blake was well known, and yet, when you were poisoned, the taste of digitalis was on your lips. You have never handled the sundial's gnomon, nor held those ledger pages. What truth do you hold as witness?" Cavendish's voice was firm. "I saw Lady Greycroft meeting Blake in secret, late last night, after I retired. They argued heatedly, over money and a will. I tried to intervene but was driven away. I believe she planned to destroy evidence. At this accusation, the room erupted in murmurs. Lady Greycroft's composure cracked for a moment. Mrs. Hawthorne gasped. Marsh looked stunned. Poirot raised his hand. "Silence, s'il vous plaît." He let the quiet settle like dust before speaking. "Each of you has now confessed to actions driven by fear, anger, or greed. Yet none of these alone accounts for the fatal stabbing, nor for the fateful timing of the ledger theft. But you have all revealed your character, your strengths and vulnerabilities. Therefore, I ask you to consider, if you were the murderer, how would you manipulate each of these elements to cast suspicion on another?" A hush fell as the guests turned inward, each grappling with their own guilt and suspicions. Hastings watched Poirot closely, noting how the detective now no longer sought statements, but reactions, to the very idea of accusation. Poirot closed his notebook with a crisp snap. "Tomorrow we shall reconvene at the sundial at noon. There I will demonstrate the precise manner in which the crime was executed and expose the culprit." He paused, allowing the gravity of those words to sink in. "For now, I release you. But remember, the sun's shadow moves inexorably toward truth, and when it falls fullest upon our circle, no deceit may endure." One by one, the guests rose, their faces a mask of anxiety and grudging respect. Lady Greycroft offered Poirot a fragile smile. Mrs. Hawthorne avoided his gaze. Mr. Marsh lingered uncertainly. Miss Ryder's fan rattled in quiet distress. Dr. Stanton's eyes glistened with unspoken turmoil, and Captain Cavendish regarded his saviour with gratitude mingled with dread. As the drawing-room door closed behind them, Hastings exhaled. "Mon ami, you have prepared the stage for the final act." Poirot tipped his head thoughtfully. "Indeed, Hastings. Tomorrow's noon will mark the culmination of our investigation. Until then, each suspect must wrestle with shadows of their own making, and the killer will find that even the darkest motive cannot remain hidden when illuminated by the sun. Outside, the wind rustled the rose bushes as though urging the dawn of revelation. And within Thornfield Manor, the players stood poised, awaiting the fateful gathering that would, at last, unmask the murderer. Chapter 11. Another Crime and a Bayou, Startling Revelation. The noon sun cast sharp shadows across the gravelled terrace as Poirot, Hastings and the remaining guests reconvened around the brass sundial replica. The garden gates had been locked, and a hush fell over Thornfield's circle, each suspect anticipating the detective's final demonstration. Yet before Poirot could speak, the distant clatter of running footsteps echoed from the servants' wing. A breathless maid appeared, her apron stained with soil. In her hands she clutched a small, mud-splattered satchel. "Monsieur Poirot, sir, I found this by the greenhouse door, half buried under the boxwood hedge." She held it out with trembling fingers. Poirot rose, his keen eyes alight. "Merci, mademoiselle, please leave us." The maid nodded and retreated, leaving the small assembly circling the ornate sundial. Hastings leaned forward. "What is it, Poirot?" Poirot unfastened the worn leather satchel and withdrew a slim volume bound in dark cloth. Its cover bore Victor Blake's initials, V.B., and inside lay finely ruled pages filled with neat, spidery script. Poirot flipped to the final entry, dated 2 nights before the murder. "Lady G, I have discovered the amendment in the will. Your solicitor's signatures are forged. Meet me by the sundial at 4. Unless rectified, I shall expose everything to the household." A collective gasp rose from the group. Lady Greycroft's face drained of colour, and even Captain Cavendish, seated in his wheelchair at the edge of the circle, gripped the armrests. Poirot's voice was low, but carried to every ear. Monsieur Blake was not merely advising on a sundial inscription. He had uncovered a forgery. Someone manipulated Lady Greycroft's will to divert her fortune. He looked around slowly, and he intended to confront the forger here, at the sundial, yesterday at 4. Miss Ryder's fan slipped from her grasp. But that means," she stammered. Poirot nodded. Mr. Blake's scathing critique of the forged signatures would have incited panic in whoever stood to lose their inheritance. "Our first stabbing occurred moments after he arrived at the sundial, and the killer anticipated his early departure. When Blake refused to be silenced, the assailant seized the moment." Dr. Stanton took a step forward, voice steady, but eyes wide. "Why was this satchel hidden in the greenhouse?" "Because," Poirot replied, "the forger needed to retrieve these damning pages once the true culprit had succeeded, either to destroy the evidence or to frame another. The greenhouse offered concealment and easy access back to the house via the servants' passage." He turned to Mrs. Hawthorne, whose pearl necklace was now clutched in both hands. "Madame, you borrowed that satchel under the pretext of fetching garden tools last night. Why did you hide Blake's journal in the boxwood?" Mrs. Hawthorne's lips trembled. I meant only to protect Lady Greycroft. I thought if I took the book, I could burn it and save her reputation." Her gaze darted to Lady Greycroft, pleading forgiveness. Lady Greycroft covered her mouth, tears brimming. "No, Almina, you misunderstand. Victor insisted on amending the forged will. I refused, begged him to relent. But I never intended for him to be harmed. Marsh leaned forward, clay dust marking his knees on the terrace stones. Then who brought this satchel out here after the murder? I noticed someone emerging from the greenhouse at dawn, slender, wearing slippers. Miss Ryder's face went pale. Those were my slippers. I went to fetch fresh flowers for tea. Poirot's gaze fixed on her. Yet you claimed to know nothing of the ledger's whereabouts, and your slippers, as you say, would leave almost no trace. You had every opportunity to move between greenhouse and garden unnoticed. Miss Ryder's hands quivered. I merely wished to distract suspicion from myself. I removed the satchel, hoping the true culprit would be found instead. At this confession, murmurs rippled through the group. Only Dr. Stanton remained inscrutable, but Poirot's eyes lingered on her perfume-scented scarf. He closed the satchel and set it on the sundial replica. We now have clearer motive. Someone stood to lose a fortune if Blake exposed the forged will. The hidden journal confirms Blake's intent to confront the forger, and the greenhouse provided the killer with a secret route. Yet we have not exposed the hand that wielded the knife, nor the mind that orchestrated these events. The assembled guests exchanged anxious glances. Hastings scribbled fervently in his notebook, while Poirot's little grey cells assembled the fragments into a coherent pattern. Poirot raised his hand. Mes amis, we have reached a pivotal juncture. The final truth remains concealed in the interplay of motive and opportunity. In our next and final gathering, I shall demonstrate precisely how the forger and murderer combined their cunning to manipulate each of you and reveal the identity of the culprit. He stepped back, allowing the weight of his promise to linger like the sudden hush before a storm. The sun at its zenith cast the brass sundial's gnomon shadow directly upon the date inscription, a silent reminder that time itself had borne witness to every crime. As the guests dispersed under Poirot's watchful eye, each carried the knowledge that the next revelation would strike with the inevitability of high noon, and that, by then, the killer's fate would be sealed. Chapter 12. The Sundial's Silent Sentence. Late afternoon light filtered through the garden's yew hedges, casting lattice-like shadows across the gravel terrace. Poirot stood beside the brass sundial replica, its gnomon now dipping low as the sun curved toward evening. Around him gathered the 5 remaining suspects, each painted with that peculiar mixture of relief and dread unique to those awaiting final judgment. Poirot surveyed them silently for a heartbeat, his little grey cells whirring. Then, with a subtle inclination of his head, he signalled Hastings to step forward and set Lady Greycroft's restored ledger at the foot of the sundial. The book's once torn pages were now bound, their missing passages replaced by meticulous transcripts in Poirot's neat hand. Mes amis, Poirot began, his voice measured, we have traced the forgery of Lady Greycroft's will, uncovered the hidden journal of Victor Blake, and identified the precise opportunities each of you had to tamper with evidence, gnomon, ledger, satchel, and glass alike. Yet one crucial element eludes us, the final movement, the moment when motive became action. For that, we must examine the sundial itself. He lifted the brass model and turned it so the shadow aligned with the inscribed hour. At exactly 4 o'clock yesterday, the sun's shadow touched this point, he said, tracing the slender line. It was then that Monsieur Blake arrived, satchel in hand, expecting confrontation. The murderer anticipated his arrival, planted the forged will, and bent the gnomon to signal an accident. When Blake recoiled, the blade, concealed in plain sight, was delivered. Poirot paused, and tension coiled in the air. Mrs. Hawthorne clutched her pearls. Marsh swallowed. Miss Ryder pressed her fan to her lips. Dr. Stanton's calm mask wavered ever so slightly, and Lady Greycroft's hands trembled against her lap. But who, Poirot asked quietly, had both the knowledge of Blake's habits and the means to orchestrate such precise timing? He allowed the question to hang as the gnomon's shadow lengthened. He stepped closer to Mrs. Hawthorne. You financed the restoration of the sundial with secret payments to Blake. You stood nearest when it was first bent, yet insisted you touched nothing. You retrieved the journal from the greenhouse, hoping to protect Lady Greycroft, yet failed to warn the victim of his peril. Mrs. Hawthorne's breath came in shallow gasps. Turning to Marsh, Poirot continued. You discovered the ledger pages and handled them without notifying anyone. Your clay-stained cuffs bear the same smudges found on the ledger's binding. You had every incentive to conceal your professional quarrel with Blake. Marsh's jaw clenched. Poirot then faced Miss Ryder. You dropped your hairpin near the sundial, then later in the study. Your slippers allowed you to slip unseen through the servants' passage. You claim only curiosity, yet your presence in both places suggests a deeper purpose. Miss Ryder's fan rattled as her eyes darted. Next, Dr. Stanton. Your expertise in digitalis marks you as the only person capable of dosing Captain Cavendish, and your lavender perfume betrayed you among the rosewater-scented victims. Your medical journals, threatened by Blake's findings, provided motive and opportunity. Dr. Stanton's composure cracked, if only momentarily. Finally, Poirot's gaze settled on Lady Greycroft herself. And you, madame, whose forged will was at the heart of this scheme, you summoned me, called upon Blake's counsel, yet behind every action was your desire to stave off ruin. You arranged the meeting, planted fear in Blake's heart, and manipulated each player as though they were pieces upon your own board. He closed his eyes for an instant, then let them open, steady and compassionate. But one among you took the ultimate step. One turned intrigue into murder. He raised a slender finger toward the sundial's base, where inlaid into the stone was a narrow slit, barely noticeable, but calibrated to hold a blade. The murderer concealed the knife here, in plain sight, beneath the very monument that signified time's passage. When Blake knelt to confront the forger, the blade was released with a practiced flick. Poirot paused, letting the assembled suspects feel the weight of his words. Each shifted uneasily. None spoke. Now, he said softly, we stand at the moment before the unmasking. In the next gathering, I will reveal the name of the person whose hand bent the gnomon, whose mind plotted the lying ledger, and whose heart delivered the fatal blow. He stepped back, the sun's last rays glinting off his immaculate moustache. Until then, mes amis, reflect upon your own reflections. In this sundial, your motives, your secrets, and the fateful hour that will judge you all." With that, Poirot gathered his notebook and led Hastings away, leaving the suspects huddled around the brass model. The shadows deepened, and Thornfield Manor held its breath, awaiting the final revelation that would pit man against time, and truth against deception. Chapter 13. The Edge of Revelation. The sun had slipped low behind the yew hedges when Poirot summoned the company for a final rehearsal of events. The terrace was nearly deserted, the hedges trimmed, the chairs moved aside, and the brass sundial replica set upon its plinth, its gnomon casting a long, deliberate shadow across the inscribed hours. A hush fell over Thornfield Manor's circle as each suspect assumed their place, hearts pounding with expectation. Poirot stepped forward, his posture composed yet charged with anticipation. "Mes amis," he said, voice calm, "we shall now walk together through the precise movements of yesterday's tragic hour. In retracing these steps, we illuminate the shadows of deception." He turned to Lady Greycroft. "Madam, please stand at the sundial's base, as you did when Monsieur Blake first arrived." Lady Greycroft complied, her pale gown brushing the gravel. She glanced at each face before settling her gaze on the stone. Poirot continued. At 4 o'clock sharp, Monsieur Blake approached from the west path, satchel in hand. "Captain Cavendish, you stood over there, by the bench." Captain Cavendish, still pale from his ordeal, wheeled himself into position, gripping the armrests. Mrs. Hawthorne, Marsh, Miss Ryder, and Dr. Stanton arranged themselves at the spots Poirot indicated, forming a loose arc that matched their positions during the first crime. "Observe the spacing," Poirot instructed. The narrow gap here allowed the assailant to conceal the blade beneath the sundial's base. Then, Blake knelt to confront the forger. He knelt himself, replicating Blake's posture, threading his fingers along the replica's edge. At that moment, the knife slipped through the hidden slot. He rose and turned to each in turn. "Who among you could have manipulated the slit so deftly without drawing attention? Whose hand is nimblest, whose nerve most unshaken?" He allowed the question to linger as the suspect shifted uneasily. Poirot then beckoned Mrs. Hawthorne forward. "Madame, you claim you only bent the gnomon accidentally, yet you financed its repair and knew exactly how it fit. Stand here and demonstrate how you moved the gnomon." She approached, trembling, and gingerly lifted the brass gnomon from its socket, her gloved fingers brushing the inlaid metal. She straightened, her face drawn. "Is this not how you did it, madam?" She swallowed and replaced the gnomon. "Yes, but I would never have done more than bend it." Next, Marsh stepped up. Poirot handed him the ledger, bound once more in its new cover. "Monsieur Marsh, you found these pages by the window. Show us how you retrieved them." Marsh opened the ledger, leafed to the marked entries, then snapped it shut. "I saw them flutter as I passed," he said quietly. "I picked them up to preserve evidence, not to hide it." Poirot's eyes glittered, and yet the ledger's pages were moved again before Blake's body was found. He nodded toward Dr. Stanton. "Doctor, you handled that ledger after dosing the wine. Demonstrate how you carried it here." Dr. Stanton's composure wavered for a heartbeat before she took the ledger, folded it under her arm, and moved with precise strides to an empty spot beside the sundial. "As you see," she said, voice measured, I needed both hands to hold these pages while concealing the file in my pocket. A murmur ran through the group. Poirot's gaze then fell upon Miss Ryder. "Mademoiselle, your hairpin was discovered in 2 places, once by the sundial, and later in Lady Greycroft's study. Tell us how you came to hold it." She pulled the pin from her hair and showed it glinting in the dying light. "I dropped it here," she said, pointing, "and later, as a distraction, I carried it inside." Poirot nodded and turned back to Lady Greycroft. "Madame, you orchestrated the meeting. Demonstrate how you lured Monsieur Blake to this very spot." She inhaled sharply, stepped forward, and gestured toward the west path. "I sent him this note," she said, reading, "Meet me by the sundial at 4. The inscription must be corrected." She held an imaginary paper in her hand, eyes downcast. As each suspect replayed their part, Poirot studied their faces, flashed knuckles, involuntary tremors, eyes that lingered too long on certain paths. He asked brief, pointed questions. "Which hand did you use to adjust the gnomon? How long did you linger before Blake arrived? Did you glance at the bench to ensure Cavendish remained unaware?" With each answer, small inconsistencies emerged. A stumble in Mrs. Hawthorne's recollection of hand positions, Marsh misplacing the ledger pages by a few inches, Dr. Stanton's pocket slightly ajar, a single hairpin prong slightly bent, 2 bent to have merely slipped. Poirot stepped back, allowing the tableau to hold its breath. "Mes amis," he said softly, "the final truth lies not only in the actions, but in the spaces between them. The hesitation, the overconfidence, the tiny flaw that betrays the hand of guilt." He swept his gaze across their uneasy faces. "Tomorrow, at sunrise, we shall assemble here one last time. The murderer will be unmasked, and the sundial's silent sentence will be spoken." He inclined his head. "For tonight, I release you to your thoughts. Reflect on what you have seen and what you have revealed. The dawn will bring clarity to all." As the guests dispersed into the gathering dusk, Hastings approached Poirot. "Mon ami, the stage is set. You have drawn out every tremor and slip." Poirot's moustache curved in a rare, solemn smile. "Oui, Hastings. When the sun rises upon Thornfield Manor, its rays will cast not only shadows upon the sundial, but also light upon the heart of our mystery." And with that, they left the terrace, hearts heavy with anticipation, each suspect haunted by the knowledge that time, like truth, would soon reveal all. Chapter 14. The threads draw, tighter dawns. First light seeped through the tall windows of the drawing-room, painting the marble floor in pale gold. Poirot stood by the hearth, polishing his little black boots with meticulous care as if preparing for a grand performance. Hastings, notebook in hand, watched him with amused admiration. The final denouement was hours away, yet each moment brimmed with anticipation. "The hour approaches, Hastings," Poirot murmured, pausing to study his reflection in the fireplace's brass fender. "Before we confront our culprit in public, there is one more subtle thread to pull." He tapped the mantel clock, its hands nearing 6. "I wish to speak with each suspect briefly, alone, to observe their reactions to a single question." Trinqueau nodded. A masterstroke. One by one, Poirot summoned Lady Greycroft, Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Marsh, Miss Ryder, and Dr. Stanton to the library's small adjoining study. Inside, the single oil lamp cast warm light over a simple writing desk and high-backed chair. Each guest found themselves seated opposite Poirot, heart fluttering at his precise gaze. Lady Greycroft entered first. Poirot offered her a glass of water before gently closing the door. "Madame," he began, "if you had only 1 minute to confess your deepest regret from these events, what would it be?" Lady Greycroft's pale fingers trembled around the crystal rim. She inhaled. "That I involved my friends in this tragedy. If I had not insisted on secrecy, none of them would have been harmed." Her voice quavered. When Poirot's gaze remained steady, her shoulders slumped, and that I allowed fear of disgrace to overshadow justice. Poirot inclined his head. "Admirable honesty, madam. Thank you." He opened the door, allowing her to depart, then quickly motioned in the next guest, Mrs. Almina. Hawthorne paused at the threshold, her pearls gleaming in the lamp glow. Poirot's question was the same. She pressed her lips together, eyes flicking to the door before she spoke. "My deepest regret is that I betrayed Lady Greycroft's trust. My payments to Blake were meant to protect her, yet I realize now I only compounded her peril." Her voice cracked and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Poirot offered a nod of sympathy before dismissing her. Mr. Lionel Marsh entered with clay-stained cuffs carefully hidden beneath his coat. When asked his regret, he stared at his hands as though seeing them for the first time. "I regret that. My pride blinded me. I was so intent on vindicating my artistic judgment that I ignored the real conflict between right and wrong. My quarrel with Blake was petty, yet it almost cost a man his life." He exhaled, shoulders slumping in relief as Poirot dismissed him. Miss Cecilia Ryder followed, fan at her side. Under Poirot's unblinking gaze, she confessed, voice barely a whisper, "I regret my vanity. I feared the scandal of Blake's revelations more than I feared his fate. My attempts at diversion, my hairpin, my slippers, were nothing but selfish tricks." She paused, then offered the faintest nod before slipping out. Finally, Dr. Evelyn Stanton entered. She removed her lavender scarf, but kept her composure as Poirot posed the same query. She closed her eyes momentarily, and then spoke with calm resolve. "My greatest regret is that I allowed ambition to eclipse compassion. I thought silencing Victor Blake would preserve my career, but nearly cost another life, Captain Cavendish's." She met Poirot's eyes. "I confess now, I would do differently if given the chance." Poirot inclined his head solemnly and sent her from the room. When the door clicked shut, Hastings whispered, "Brilliant, mon ami. You have drawn out contrition from all." Poirot tapped his temple. "Indeed, but note their faces as they left. Who among them carried true relief, and who only feigned repentance? That distinction, Hastings, is the final thread." He crossed to the writing desk and retrieved the sundial replica's gnomon, turning it slowly between nimble fingers. "At high noon, the shadow will fall just so, exposing the slot from which the knife struck. Until then, we have one remaining moment to steel ourselves." He held the brass piece aloft. "And one more question to pose in the drawing-room. Who among you can look upon this gnomon and feel no stirring of conscience?" Hastings smiled. "You leave nothing to chance." Poirot replaced the gnomon and stepped to the windows. Outside, the terrace lay still, the brass sundial gleaming in the early light. "Soon," he whispered to himself, "the sun will pass, its peak, and with it the last shadow of doubt." As the final minutes ticked away, Thornfield Manor held its breath. Section by section, the story had built its tapestry of deceit. Now, at the story's penultimate stage, the threads drew so tight that only the smallest twitch would unravel the murderer's carefully woven mask, and lead to the ultimate reveal in Section 15. Chapter 15. The final question, the drawing room, was hushed, its heavy curtains drawn, and the hearth fire banked low. At the centre, Poirot stood behind a small table on which the brass sundial replica lay, its gnomon casting a spidery shadow across the polished wood. Around him sat the 5 suspects, each now gaunt with tension, while Hastings remained by the door, ready to note every nuance. Poirot's dark eyes flicked slowly from face to face. "Mes amis," he began, "we have retraced each step, examined every motive, and unmasked every concealment. There remains but one question, one final test of conscience." He tapped the gnomon. "Who among you can gaze upon this gnomon, so entwined in our tragedy, and feel no stirring of remorse or guilt?" A tremor passed through the room. Mrs. Hawthorne's fingers tightened around her fan. She swallowed twice before answering, voice quavering, I admit the sight brings a weight upon my heart. I acted out of fear, not malice." She bent her head, eyes damp. Marsh shifted in his chair, glancing at the replica's intricate base. "For me, it is the strand of regret that binds me, yet I would never have wielded the blade." His voice held a fervent edge. Miss Ryder's fan stilled. She lifted her chin with a brittle composure. "My conscience pricks me for distracting you all, but not for murder." Her eyes darted, as though seeking unseen reassurance. Dr. Stanton inhaled, the faintest trace of lavender drifting in her wake, and settled her gaze unwaveringly on the gnomon. "My regret is measured by my ambition, but I did not deliver the fatal blow." She folded her hands, lips pressed tight. Poirot allowed their confessions to hang in the silent air. Then, with a slight nod, he addressed Lady Greycroft, who sat, paling in her chair. "Madame, you arranged that meeting at 4. You knew precisely how the gnomon fit its socket, and yet you claim only to have sought an explanation of the will's forgery. Tell us, when you look upon this, do you feel only the sorrow of unintended consequences?" Lady Greycroft's breath caught. She rose unsteadily and approached the table. Her hand hovered just above the gnomon, quivering. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, "I feel more than sorrow. I feel responsibility. I called him here, believing words alone could resolve our disputes. I never imagined it would lead to blood." Poirot's gaze was compassionate, yet unrelenting. "Your admission is most telling, madame. Yet it remains to identify the one among you who transformed responsibility into murder." He turned and clicked his fingers. A servant entered with a small folded note and placed it before him. Poirot unfolded it, a single line written in a bold, steady hand. "At 4, the gnomon's shadow conceals the truth. Seek beneath its base, where only guilt can hide." Poirot refolded the note and faced the company. This message arrived, an hour ago, authored by our culprit, seeking to revel in the morbid cleverness of a hidden slot beneath the sundial. One of you knows its precise location, for only the murderer could have penned such details. He paused, voice dropping. We shall meet next at the terrace, where the sun's shadow will fall directly upon the gnomon's base. There, the secret chamber beneath will admit only one hand, the one stained by culpability. A tense silence followed as Poirot replaced the note in his pocket and gestured toward the door. Mes amis, if you truly seek absolution, accompany me to Thornfield's terrace. The sun will reveal the final secret, and the murderer's hand will be laid bare. One by one, the guests rose, faces pale and strained. Outside, the late afternoon light filtered through the windows, promising the last illumination of this tangled mystery, and the revelation that awaited in Section 16. Chapter 16. High Noons. Shadow. The terrace was bathed in the bright glare of the sun as Poirot led the hesitant assembly out onto the gravel, each step accompanied by the soft crunch of tiny stones. The brass sundial perched on its stone plinth stood at the centre, its gnomon casting a crisp shadow that stretched across the hour mark of 12. A gentle breeze stirred the rose bushes, carrying the faint scent of blossoms and tension. Poirot paused before the replica and surveyed his companions. Lady Greycroft, her pale features drawn with apprehension. Mrs. Hawthorne, clutching her pearls, as though they might anchor her to innocence. Mr. Marsh, whose restless eyes flitted between the sundial and his fellow suspects. Miss Ryder, fan trembling in her hand, and Dr. Stanton, her calm facade betraying a rapid intake of breath. Even Captain Cavendish had been wheeled out, pale but resolute, his eyes bright with expectation. Mes amis, Poirot announced, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. The moment has arrived. Observe how the shadow falls upon the base of our gnomon. He stepped aside, allowing them to study the narrow seam where the brass met the stone. At this precise alignment, the hidden compartment reveals itself to the curious hand. He retrieved a slender rod from his waistcoat and tapped the seam. With a soft click, a concealed panel shifted open, revealing a shallow recess. All eyes widened as the dark cavity emerged, a secret slot designed to hold a slender object. Poirot's moustache quivered with satisfaction. Now, he continued, I invite each of you to place a hand within this recess. He motioned to Mrs. Hawthorne first. She approached, hesitated, and withdrew her fingers with trembling embarrassment. I feel nothing, she whispered. Marsh stepped forward next, brushing clay from his coat cuff before probing the recess. He withdrew immediately, cheeks flushed. It's empty, he said, voice unsteady. Miss Ryder forced herself to advance. She slipped the tip of her finger into the panel, then recoiled with a soft gasp. There is something here. She withdrew a small blood-tinted fragment of brass, the notched portion of the gnomon. This must be from the original, she murmured. Poirot inclined his head. Indeed, mademoiselle, and yet this does not indict our murderer. It is but the clue left for all eyes to see. He gestured to Dr. Stanton. Your turn, Doctor. Stanton moved with composed precision, pressing her slender hand into the recess. She extracted a thin scrap of paper, its edges frayed. Unfolding it, she revealed a hastily written line, words that matched the earlier note. Guilt lies in the hidden hand. She looked up calmly. An infernal game, she said quietly. Finally, Poirot stepped forward. And now, Lady Greycroft. The hostess of Thornfield Manor approached the sundial, slow and deliberate. Her gloved hand hesitated, suspended above the panel. Poirot spoke softly. "Madame, consider what you seek. Absolution or accusation?" She met his steady gaze, then laid her fingers upon the recess. Against her glove she felt something smooth and cold. With a quick motion, she withdrew a small linen-wrapped package, stained faintly with red. Gasps rippled through the group as she untied the strings to reveal the slender knife, its blade glinting wickedly. Silence fell like a shroud. Poirot stepped forward, eyes blazing with intensity. "Mes amis, the hidden hand that retrieved this weapon belongs to the only person who could both access this recess and return it without suspicion." He turned slowly, addressing the cowering figure of Lady Greycroft. "Madam, your courage is admirable, but your innocence is lost." Lady Greycroft sank to her knees, the blade slipping from her grasp onto the gravel. "It was not meant to kill," she cried. "I only wished to frighten him. Once the will was amended, all would be well again." Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. "The line between fright and fatality is perilously thin, madam. You orchestrated the confrontation, you bent the gnomon, you forged the will, and when Monsieur Blake resisted, you delivered the blow." The others exchanged stunned glances. Mrs. Hawthorne's face crumpled with grief. Marsh bowed his head. Dr. Stanton's calm facade broke, and Miss Ryder covered her mouth in shock. Even Captain Cavendish wheeled forward, stared in disbelief. "Hastings," Poirot said quietly, "fetch the constable." As Hastings hurried away, Poirot knelt beside Lady Greycroft. Fear can drive us to heinous acts, but justice must prevail. He placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Moments later, the constable arrived, and Lady Greycroft was led away in simple handcuffs, her jewelled necklace glinting one last time in the sunlight. Thornfield Manor's sundial stood silent witness to her fate. Poirot rose, brushing dust from his trousers, and addressed the remaining circle. "Story and crime are woven from human frailty, greed, pride, desperation. May this tragedy remind us that even the most elegant facade cannot conceal the darkness within one's heart." Hastings joined him, notebook closed. "Mon ami, your little grey cells have served justice once more." Poirot allowed himself a slight melancholy smile. "Indeed, Hastings, the sun's shadow has passed its zenith. And now, as the dial marks the hour, we reflect upon time's eternal witness and the hidden truths it unveils." With that, the case of the tilted sundial reached its silent conclusion, leaving Thornfield Manor to its echoes of betrayal and the promise of justice restored. Chapter 17. Aftermath and reckoning with Lady Greycroft safely in custody, Thornfield Manor fell into a subdued hush. The remaining guests gathered once more in the drawing-room, their faces marked by relief, sorrow, and lingering disbelief. Poirot, seated in his velvet armchair, surveyed them with a gentle sternness. "Hastings," he said, "please see that each of our friends is cared for. The shock of unmasking one so esteemed will not fade quickly. Hastings rose to attend to Mrs. Hawthorne, Mr. Marsh, Miss Ryder, Dr. Stanton, and Captain Cavendish, each still trembling from the day's revelations. The captain, though weak, managed a nod of gratitude as Hastings offered him a glass of water and a reassuring smile. Poirot addressed the group, voice softening. "Mes amis, today we have witnessed how fear of disgrace can drive even the most dignified to ruinous acts. Yet justice has prevailed. Madame Greycroft will face the law, and her fate lies now beyond our influence." He paused, letting his words find their weight. Mrs. Hawthorne dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I confess, I mourn the loss of friendship more than anything. She was my hostess, my friend." "True," Poirot replied, "but friendship built on deception is precarious. In our folly to protect her, we each bore the burden of silence. Let this be a lesson in candour and courage." Mr. Marsh cleared his throat. "I shall never again let pride blind me to a friend's needs." Miss Ryder, her fan folded, added, "And I will value life's fragility above genteel appearances." Dr. Stanton touched her neck where a lavender scarf once lay. "Ambition must be tempered with conscience. I shall never forget the price paid here." Even Captain Cavendish managed a weak smile. "I forgive her, as I forgive us all. May she find mercy." Poirot nodded gravely. "Compassion, mes amis, is the cornerstone of justice. Though Lady Greycroft's actions were inexcusable, mercy remains our highest virtue." He rose, smoothing the lapels of his coat. "I believe my work here is done. Thornfield Manor will heal in time, with roots strengthened by truth." He turned to Hastings. "Mon ami, shall we take our leave?" Hastings closed his notebook. "Yes, Hercule, the case is closed." As they crossed the terrace one final time, the brass sundial stood silent, its gnomon straight and proud once more. The garden, now bathed in gentle twilight, seemed to exhale, as if relieved the sun's long shadow had passed. Poirot paused beside the sundial, placing a hand on its polished brass. "Time, Hastings, reveals all. Today it bore witness to deception and to justice. May we never forget its lessons." Hastings placed an arm around Poirot's shoulders. "You are right, and the little grey cells have triumphed yet again." That, they headed back toward the manor's great doors, leaving Thornfield Circle to mend their lives in the soft glow of afterglow, and to carry forward the truth uncovered beneath the tilted sundial. The final chapter awaited its closing. Words, but for now, justice had been served, and peace, though fragile, had been restored. Chapter 18. Outcome and Justice. A fortnight later, Thornfield Manor's rose gardens bloomed anew, their petals untouched by the tragedy that had unfolded beneath the tilted sundial. Detective Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings arrived just as the early morning dew glistened on the grass, the air fragrant with promise. The case was closed, the culprit brought to trial, and each of the remaining guests had departed, carrying lessons learned at a heavy price. Lady Greycroft's trial had concluded swiftly. The court heard Poirot's meticulous reconstruction of events, Hastings's faithful testimony, and the damning evidence of the hidden slot beneath the sundial. Though her motives, fear of disgrace, desperation to protect a legacy, elicited some sympathy. The deliberate forgery and the fatal blow left the jury little choice. She was sentenced to a term appropriate for her station, but stern enough to reflect the grave breach of trust and the loss of life. As Poirot and Hastings strolled toward the terrace, they encountered Mrs. Hawthorne arranging rose cuttings in the greenhouse. She paused, offering a gentle nod. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she greeted softly. "Thank you for your kindness during the trial. I have resolved to restore Lady Greycroft's gardens in her absence, to honour what was once a place of beauty." Poirot inclined his head. "A fitting tribute, madam. In nurturing these roses, you atone for the walls of silence that once sheltered deceit." He allowed himself a small, approving smile before moving on. By the drawing-room window, Mr. Marsh arranged a modest display of his sculptures, now commissioned to capture Thornfield's restored sundial. He looked up as they passed. "Monsieur Poirot, I owe you gratitude. You taught me humility, and in my work I shall remember the fragility beneath the facade." Poirot's moustache twitched. Art, like morality, demands precision of heart as much as hand, n'est-ce pas? He pressed a finger to Marsh's shoulder. "Continue to shape both with care." Miss Ryder emerged from the library, a single white blossom pinned to her lapel. She curtsied lightly. "Detective, I have given to each guest a sprig of rose, symbol of remembrance and renewal. My vanity has changed its shape." She held out a small bouquet. "For you, Monsieur Poirot, in gratitude." He accepted the flowers with a gracious nod. "You have learned that the smallest gesture can speak louder than the grandest design." He inhaled their fragrance, then replaced them gently in her hand. "Offer them instead to Captain Hastings. His loyalty deserves their beauty." Stanton appeared by the terrace gate, her lavender scarf replaced with a simple white kerchief. "Monsieur Poirot, I have donated my medical journals to the hospital library, along with a preface acknowledging my errors. Science must serve humanity, not ambition." She extended her hand, which Poirot shook firmly. "Your mea culpa is as courageous as any cure," he replied. "May your future work heal without harm." At last, they reached the sundial itself. The original gnomon had been reforged and restored to its upright place, its shadow marking the hour with renewed dignity. The brass replica, now housed in the manor's small museum, stood nearby as a testament to the case's cunning. Captain Cavendish, wheeled onto the terrace by a kindly steward, raised a grateful salute. "Bravo, Hercule! You have given us back our peace and taught us to cherish it." Poirot laid a gentle hand on the captain's shoulder. "Mon cher ami, peace is the reward of truth. You, who survived the poison's touch, embody perseverance." Hastings stepped forward. "So, mon ami, what will you do now? Another case surely awaits." Poirot straightened, smoothing his coat. He gazed down at the sundial, then turned to his companion. "For now, Hastings, I shall enjoy the serenity of a mystery laid to rest. But the world remains full of puzzles, some grand, some minute, and my little grey cells require ongoing exercise." Hastings chuckled. "I take it we will not rest entirely." "Rest," Poirot replied with a twinkle, "is for the weary soul. The detective's mind, however, must ever be vigilant. After all, timing is everything, and I must ensure I am always, how you say, au premier rang. As the sun climbed toward midday, its rays fell across the sundial's straight gnomon, casting a shadow that pointed unwaveringly toward the future. And so, with justice served and lessons learned, Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings departed Thornfield Manor, leaving behind a circle of friends forever changed by the affair at the Puzzle of the Tilted Sundial.